Dober večer, ime mi je Nada Pretnar, sem iz Gibanja za pravice Palestincev. To je neformalna skupina, ki deluje v solidarnosti z palestinskim narodom. Torej, dobrodošli na to, kar v resnici je drugi dogodek, ki se nekako je rodil delno tudi na pobudo Vodnikove domačije, kolikor je v sklopu ciklusa, ki smo ga nekako imenovali ali so ga imenovali Palestina v besedah in ki nekako se bo odvijal skozi naslednje mesece in med temi dogodki bomo srečali razne predstavnike palestinske kulture, palestinske pisatelje, pesnike in bomo videli, kako se bo cela stvar razvila. Na vsak način jaz bi rada zahvalila Vodnikovi domačiji za to pobudo, da nekako damo glas palestinski kulturi, ki je izredno bogata in ki se jo tako malo pozna tukaj pri nas in mislim, ko rečem pri nas na zapadu. Bi rada še na kratko povedala, da ta današnji večer naj bi ga bil vodil profesor Nikolaj Jeffs, saj je bila tudi njegova ta ideja, da bi danes povabili prav Rajo Shehadeh. Nažalost, Nikolaj Jeffs proti njegovi volji, seveda proti svoji volji, se je mogel odreči današnjemu večeru in zato se zahvaljujem KRISTINI BOŽIČ, ki je nekako nam priskočila. Kristina sicer jo vsi dobro poznamo, tudi kot veliko prijateljico Palestine in poznavalko. In zato si res zahvaljujem za to. Bi rada, upam, da kaj ne pozabljam, bi rada vam v dveh besedah predstavila gosta, ampak mislim, da ga vsi že v resnici poznate. Dovolj, da pogledate malo okoli Kristine in vidite, koliko knjig njegovih je. Ogromno, v bistvu je zelo, zelo prolifičen pisatelj, piše skoraj eno knjigo ali dve knjigi vsako leto, vsake 2 leti, oprostite. Rajo Shehadeh se nam je pridružil iz Ramale, kjer živi v Palestini in se bo pogovarjal s Kristino. Sicer pa bomo začeli ta dogodek malo drugače kot ponavadi, v smislu, da nas je Raža prosil, če bi on najprej prebral stran ali 2 z njegove knjige Palestinski Sprehodi, ki je v bistvu edina knjiga prevedena v slovenščino, upamo, da bodo tudi še kakšne, in potem pa začne pravi pogovor s Kristino. Torej, jaz zdaj predam besedo v bistvu Raži, ne, Kristina, če sem dobro razumela. Hvala lepa.
Hvala, Nada. Thank you, Nada. It's a great honor, Raja, to have you with us. I won't lose too many words to describe you, a legal scholar of global importance, I think, founder of Al-Haq, an incredible writer and author. And I will give you the word to somehow honor us with some pages from your book Palestinian Walks, that is also a winner of the Orwell Prize of the year 2008. Good evening to Ramallah, and please.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me on this Zoom session. I thought I would start by reading from Palestinian Walks from the introduction of the book. And I will read a very short excerpt. And the reason why I want to read is I think when the author's voice is heard, it helps readers when they're reading the book. I've always enjoyed hearing the author of a book read. And even though it's a very short piece, I think I'm going to start with it. And as I said, it's from the introduction to the book. When I began hill walking in Palestine a quarter of a century ago, I was not aware that I was traveling through a vanishing landscape. For centuries, the central highland hills of Palestine, which slope on one side towards the sea and on the other towards the desert, had remained relatively unchanged. As I grew up in Ramallah, the land from my city to the northern city of Nablus might, with a small stretch of the imagination, have seemed familiar to a contemporary of Christ. Those hills were, I believe, one of the natural treasures of the world. All my life, I've lived in houses that overlook the Ramallah hills. I have related to them like my own private backyard, whether for walks, picnics, or flower-picking expeditions. I have watched their changing colors during the day and over the seasons, as well as during an unending sequence of wars. I've always loved hill walking, whether in Palestine, the Swiss Alps, or the highlands and outlying islands of Scotland, where it was a particular joy to ramble without fear of harassment and the distracting awareness of imminent political and physical disasters. I began taking long walks in Palestine in the late 1970s. This was before many of the irreversible changes that blighted the land began to take place. The hills then were like one large nature reserve with all the unspoiled beauty and freedom unique to such areas. The 6 walks described in this book span a period of 27 years. Although each walk takes its own unique course, they are also travels through time and space. It is a journey beginning in 1978 and ending in 2007, in which I write about the developments I have witnessed in the region and about the changes to my life and surroundings. I describe walking in the hills around Ramallah, in the wadis in the Jerusalem wilderness, and through the gorgeous ravines by the Dead Sea. I will stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think one of the amazing things about your writing is even when we take a book, whether it's the Palestinian Walks that has been translated by Zoje Skušek in 2012 to Slovenian, some books from before or from after, they all somehow still sound important. They still bring all the urgency that somehow in everyday life seems to be somehow not forgotten, but it seems that we're too busy somehow to notice it. And you write about also the changes that happened to the land. And I remember that at one point you said that sooner or later the land will take back what it's hers, or the nature will take back what's hers. But I'm wondering, in Palestinian Walks, you write a lot about the changes. Can you tell us a little bit? The changes are ongoing, and it seems that the time in the occupied Palestine is on the side of Israel. What's happening? What are the changes you are currently living?
Well, first, I'd like to say that before the occupation in the West Bank, our experience of changes in the landscape were minimal. So, for example, as one manifestation of this, we looked around at the hills around us, and we thought they were mountains because we had no experience of mountains. And in fact, we call these hills in Arabic jbal rather than tlal, which is the word for hills. And we never imagined that it was possible to go into these hills and build in the remote areas housing and connect the housing to roads and connect it to infrastructure of electricity and sewage and so on and water. Because in our experience, building a house was a very big thing, which it took from a year to a year and a half. And every house had its cistern. And we didn't have the means to imagine building cities in the hills. And after the occupation, owning and running a bulldozer was not allowed. You had to take permit, and it was not possible to get a permit for a bulldozer. And yet, when the occupation started, we saw a massive development in these hills, which created new cities and new areas of habitation for now over 500,000 people who are living there, with all the infrastructure and roads and electricity and water So the changes have been tremendous, and they imply that Israel, as a colonial power and a power with the means, was able to devastate our landscape and our life and change it entirely. And that is what has been happening over the past over the past 53 years.
And do you feel that as a writer, you have somehow gone, being a lawyer, somehow stepping in the footsteps of your father and then finding your own way, being the founder of Al-Haq, documenting human rights abuses, now writing, and I'm wondering, as a writer, do you feel, or has the way you tell stories, has it changed, or do you feel that, seeing the changes happening and nothing changing, although you warn about it, or you talk about the violations of international law, you talk about the illegality, you talk about nothing normal about the normality that you live, that it's, normality of dispossession and humiliation. How do you deal as a writer to tell these stories over and over again, and yet keep the hope or prevent this from actually contributing to the normalization of something that shouldn't and can't be normalized?
Well, I started with Al-Haq and with writing on legal aspects and documentation. And we managed to cover almost all the subjects that are necessary to explain how this occupation runs and how it is administered and how the settlers become part of Israel and Israeli law while living outside of Israel, and all these legal aspects and so on. And we published a lot. And then I started writing my literary books and realized that through writing literary books, it is possible to reach many more people and make them understand much better than the legal aspects and legal pamphlets. So, for example, in Palestinian Walks, I described the case of Albina. And I described the case of Albina in great detail, making known to the reader about the legal challenges and the legal twists that Israel had to take in order to take this land, which belonged to a private person, and designate it as a land that is not private and that belongs to only the Jewish people. And so through writing of the Albina case, I was able to reach many more people because the book became very popular and was translated into many languages, and they all came to understand about the legal maneuvers that Israel was doing, much more so than it was possible in the past to do through legal pamphlets. I also tried in this book to mention the names of the people on the Israeli side who were involved in the process. I usually do not mention names of the people that I'm talking about, but in this case, I decided I will mention them by name, hoping that they might read the book at some point and feel shamed or change or realize what they've done. And the book has been translated into Hebrew, by the way, and it was published by a good publisher in Israel. And so the likelihood that they might have read the book is there. But at the same time, I realized that even though several of my books have been published in Hebrew, I don't believe that the books have made a huge difference. And I realized that books make a difference, but it takes a long time. So the changes in people's consciousness comes about much more effectively through books that are literary and that are well written and that reach to the person, and much more so than any other medium. So for example, when you see a film, you are touched by the film, but the images strike you immediately, but they don't stay with you often. Whereas when you're reading a book, you interact with the book and you become more involved because you involve your imagination as you are reading. And so books are much more effective. And I think that through the books, there have been positive changes in the way people in the world understand about Israel and what Israel is doing in the occupied territories. And that gives me hope.
Okay, that's great to hear. And talking about hope, it's interesting also that when we talked to Richard Falk, he mentioned the global solidarity movement, whether it's BDS or other campaigns, talking about Palestine. And it seems today with the pandemic, this saying, no one is safe until everybody is safe, has been popularized in a different way. But it seems that it should be also thought about when talking about Palestine. And it's interesting in the book, Shifting Sands, that you have edited with your wife, Penny Johnson. She mentions in the beginning of the book, somehow the historical context of the present and of the events that are happening. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, how do you see, because even in Europe, even in the West, we see somehow this ethno-exclusivism, the supremacy of either white people or just rich people taking place. Somehow the politics that are based on hatred and on exclusion gaining ground. Do you see it as somehow the last grasps of ideas that are for sure going away? So like the last attempts to attain or retain power? Or is this something that's much more menacing and dangerous? Because globalism is happening. We see that, there are global campaigns. Somehow young people have a different voice from the politicians that sound out of place and out of touch with the reality and global challenges that we face as, in a way, human beings or just beings on our planet.
Well, speaking of the global, I used to believe that when and if a natural disaster should happen in our region, this would bring us closer together, the Israelis and the Palestinians, because we would both be involved in the same dilemma and the same catastrophe. But now the pandemic has happened, and it made me realize that it is not necessarily so, because Israel is a powerful state and is a state that has the ability to organize and plan. And as we saw with the pandemic, it planned and has realized the inoculation and the vaccination of almost all the people in the state, and didn't inoculate the people who are under its responsibility in Gaza and in the West Bank. And so I think that this was an example of a situation where the pandemic, which is shared because viruses do not observe borders, has still not made the realization that we are in the same boat, we and Israel. And I think that Richard Falk has spoken about the changes in the world as far as Palestine is concerned, and he believes that even in America there are changes in the view that the American people see the situation in Palestine and Israel. And I think that this is very important, and this is happening all the time. And it will eventually bring about changes in the region and in the outcome. But it hasn't come to the point that it is making an impact on us yet. And so globalization hasn't really affected the way things happen here, because we are stuck in this Israel, which is still racist and concerned about its own people, and doesn't admit the existence of the other, the Palestinian. And that's very tragic. And that until that changes, I don't think we can see big changes in our future.
But do you, like, given your experiences and the life you have lived, where do you see should more effort be somehow made for this balance of power to change? Are there any simple answers? I mean, do you see a way out, or do you see a way to better future, or on what people not in Palestine should focus on when it comes to solidarity with?
Well, I think there are some interesting developments. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, for example, is a very important change. And if there should be investigation, which they're going to investigate the crimes that Israelis have done, and should there be any indictments, then, or even if there were not indictments, just the fear amongst Israelis who are perpetuating and committing these crimes, even the consciousness, the awareness that they might be held responsible for their actions could be very important and could be a deterrence. And so far there hasn't been any deterrence, any consequence for their actions against the Palestinians, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank. And so this is one thing. The other thing is that my hope and my belief is that despite everything, we as people, as human beings, are all connected, and human beings do not like to see other human beings being treated in a discriminatory fashion. So the people in the world fought against the apartheid regime in South Africa, and eventually it changed, and that was important. And now it's beginning to be seen by the people who are following the situation here that Israel is also committing apartheid against the Palestinians. And that would bring about results, because Israel is part of the world, regardless of the fact that it sees itself as a global power, which it is a global power. It's still part of the world. And if the people in the world see it as discriminating against the Palestinians, then there will be consequences for that, and there will be Israel would have to change.
Okay. I mean, myself coming from a legal background, it's very nice to hear that you do still have hope in somehow the legal tools and international law nonetheless. And it seems, for me, it was also interesting. I mean, one of the last articles you wrote, I think, was about Issa Amro before his, well, not indictment, but before the court decided on the punishment. Also, Al-Haq has been, if I understand correctly, involved in the preparation of a report about prosecution of human rights defenders in Palestine, especially also about Khalida Jarrar, who also played a role in writing the application for the International Criminal Court. And elections are coming up. It seems that more and more pressure is building. Do you feel that these are important moments that things can change? Is democracy possible under occupation?
I think under occupation, it's really an occupation that is governed by the Oslo agreements, which restrict the possibilities for maneuvering of the Palestinians. And the elections are not going to change that. So we are stuck in a framework which is very restrictive, and that doesn't allow for much hope. But on the part of the law, and my belief in the law and the importance of the law is a means of explaining and describing a situation that is important to hold on to. And unless we hold on to the international rules of occupation, we will not be able to describe what is happening here, and we will not have a standard by which to describe what is happening here. So I continue to believe that law, even though it's violated all the time by Israel, and the violation goes uncensored by anybody outside, it's still, I think, it's very important.
Okay. I will just add to everybody who is with us and watching, we're also somehow collecting questions, so they will be then sent to me and we will include them in our talk. I'm wondering, your experience, you mentioned the legal battles, you have written books, analyzed how Israel has somehow taken over the legal tools to actually dispossess and humiliate Palestinians. Do you feel that telling stories, literature, art, can it be subjugated? Do you feel that you are somehow working or creating in the realm of freedom?
Well, you know, all the books that I've written in order to make myself understand myself and my reactions and my situation, and that process of understanding has been very important, and it continues. I continue to try and understand more and write about what I understand and describe it in books that I write. And so it's not really related to, it can't be subjugated. No, I don't think it can be subjugated.
Okay. Now, in your last book, let me hopefully find it. Yes, Going Home. There is also a part where you describe being at the barber, Iskandar. I hope I will pronounce it correctly. And he says in Ramallah, not to you, to another younger customer, just remember that it's only the weak who do not forgive. Can you tell us a bit more about this sentence, or what it means to you, or how you understand it? Because it's very difficult not to be weak, probably sometimes.
You know, the funny thing is that Israel is not weak, it's very strong, and it's a global power. And yet, after the passage of 53 years since the Nakba, they're still unwilling to even recognize that the Nakba took place. No, sorry, 73 years since the Nakba, and they're still not willing to recognize that the Nakba took place. And even though there have been, in Haaretz, for example, one of the daily newspapers, there were articles published about the looting that took place of Arab homes in the various cities, and how everybody was involved in the looting. Yet still they do not recognize that there was a Palestinian presence in the land, and that this Palestinian presence had been there for many, many, many years and centuries, and that they have become refugees, and they don't even recognize that they are refugees. They don't recognize that they are refugees that have the right to return as refugees. And so it's disappointing to realize that even after all these years, there haven't been any willingness on Israel for apologizing, for recompense, for offering anything to the Palestinians in any terms that recognize what they've done to us. And they've done terrible things to us, not only deprived us of properties and homes and land, but of a future.
Do you feel that this is, I mean, because for sure, what we see on the side of Palestinians, it's incredible perseverance and dignity. But is the power that we see on the Israel side, is it a sign of its, in a way, weakness?
I think I can't really speak about the Israeli side, because I think they should speak for themselves about it. But I can say that there have been many changes over the years that I've witnessed in the Israeli side. And I think that, yes, there is an element of fear that underlies much of their behavior. But it's also changes that have occurred in their curriculum. For example, now most of the Israelis who have grown up in the past 2 generations at least have been taught that the land is theirs because of the Bible. The emphasis on the Bible is not has not always been there. It's a new thing. And now Israel has become a religious place, and people, and this has affected the relations between us. So, for example, before I was able to go and argue with a Palestinian who was trying to settle the land and take the land of Palestinians when I was defending the land in the legal cases. And I would argue with them and say, but the law says that this is a private land and so on. Now they would say, the land is ours because God gave it to us by the Bible. And that puts an end to any possibility for argument. If you're going to believe in God giving land to people, then what more can you say? So I think this reliance on religion and on spurious arguments about how the land is theirs, and on history that isn't really true, because the fact is that, so for example, they say that they won the liberation from the British. Well, the British were the people who ultimately helped Israel most of all. They did the Balfour Declaration, they did the mandate, which was biased towards building a Jewish state. And so to say that they won the liberation from the British is not really true history. And yet they grow up on these bases and are taught these bases. And at the end of the Palestinian walks, I have an argument with a Jewish settler in which I say all these things and he answers. And I thought it was interesting to put both sides of the story. But I think they have great fear. Yes, they have great. There's also great fear about the Holocaust. The present generation, of course, of Israel and Israelis have not had any direct experience with the Holocaust. But the Holocaust is so inculcated in their minds, and they are made to fear about the Holocaust that it's an adopted thing that gives them insecurity, because you often hear them say, oh, if this happens, there will be a Holocaust. But there's not going to be a Holocaust. Israel is a global power, and they should be beyond that fear. I mean, that's not to deny the Holocaust or not teach the Holocaust in their schools, but to emphasize it to the point of making them scared of the Holocaust, I think is unhealthy and a sign of weakness.
Mm-hmm. What do you fear? Because many people warn that the end project is that Palestinians are somehow taken off land in one way or another, eliminated, forced away. What do you fear? Is that a real fear that people have in the West Bank, on the occupied territory, in Gaza? That
if one were to sit and think about it, this would be the real fear. My uncle, who died at 94, continued to say that we are not going to be here for many years more, because we are going to be forced out of the land eventually by Israel. And the fact is that Israeli settlements are always built on top, high. So above Ramallah, there is Sagot, for example, the settlement. And above Ramallah, there is Dolev, another settlement. And when during this second Intifada, the people in Dolev had tanks and they shot at Ramallah and in fact killed a woman and a number of people. And so the possibility that in a state of war or in a state of emergency, I don't know what exactly that would be, they could shoot at us and force us all out, and they're capable of doing that. So, and also the fact that they haven't recognized the Palestinians as a nation, and haven't made any attempts to live together with us, nor find a way to coexist, means, objectively speaking, that it's a very dangerous situation that we're living under, and we might eventually be forced out. But at the same time, people here, I don't think of that and live as though they're going to live here forever. And that is a power, I think. I called it sumud, perseverance. And I've always believed that our strongest card with Israel is our persistence to stay here and live here and thrive and do our best and not give up. even though Israel tries its best to make life very difficult for us. And so I don't think people live with that fear, although objectively it is a real fear. I hope I'm explaining myself correctly.
No, it is. I would actually, if you allow me, I would like to read one part. It's from the book where the line is drawn. And
Yes.
You mention it's about learning Hebrew, and the teacher takes a group. So the Palestinian teacher began pointing out various signs in Hebrew and asking them to read them. These were the new names that the Jewish settlers had given to the Arab quarter of the old city. They came upon some writing on the wall, and the teacher asked if they could read it. They couldn't, so he began. What's this first letter? M. And the second, A. Then he read it for them. Mavet la Aravim. You know what this means? Death to the Arabs. And this is incredibly powerful. And I think your writing does that. It somehow connects the power and the horrible or horrid situations that the occupation brings, and yet it offers these images of what has been, what it could be. It gives tools also to understand something beyond. But nonetheless, not for me to interpret too much. My question would be, how to fight against this kind of hateful power, or this power of hate, when people think, death to Arabs?
Well, death to Arabs is a slogan that is painted on the walls of many people all the time, in villages, on cars, in cities. Death to Arabs in Hebrew, Mavet al-Aravim. And the soldiers and the law enforcement do not fight it back. And it's not just death to Arabs. They actually shoot many Arabs and in cold blood, and they're not taken to account, and destroy property and throw fire bombs at homes and burn people inside, as has happened several times. And so it's not a one-time incident. But in this book where the line is drawn, the conception of the book was to write about the changes over the many years of the occupation in relations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and to show that it hasn't always been the same. In the beginning of the occupation, there was interaction and going back and forth. There weren't these borders. Everybody could visit any place in the area, Gaza and Israel and the West Bank, and people from Israel came to Ramallah, for example, on Shabbat, to eat at the restaurants in Ramallah. There was more work done between the two sides, and possibilities and friendships that arose, and so on. And then that changed, and I. In that book, I go through the changes over the years, and in order to show that it's not, one should not take the situation as it is now and say that's it, that is how it's going to be all the time. Things change and develop, and events happen, and so that, I think, gives me hope, that and should give people hope, that it's never constant, and there are always possibilities for change, and change does come. And change, when it comes very quickly. So, for example, when the Oslo Accords were declared, and the Declaration of Principle in 1993 was published, although I immediately realized that it was a terrible thing and it had no hope for us at all, it just was a disaster. Most people didn't know this, and they just heard that there was a peace made between the two sides, and I was shocked at the changes that happened very, very quickly. So young people who had been fighting and saying, we will fight to the end with the gun. When this happened, they said, well, we should give peace a chance and look forward to the future, and so on. And they were willing to change immediately. And yet, unfortunately, this was a false peace, and it brought disaster. But when I saw how quickly people changed, even under a false peace, I realized that I must not always think in terms of what I know and of what, I mean, the people who were talking like that did not have an experience of the First Intifada. So, for example, which to me was a time of great hope and a time of when people got together in a way, and great solidarity was between people, and we had great hopes from it. But then I realized that these are not experiences that people who were born a few years later had, because they didn't go through it. And I shouldn't ascribe to them what I knew and what I experienced, because they didn't know, they didn't go through it.
Okay. And I would come back to the First Intifada, but we have here a question from Andras Rozman that refers a bit more to what you were saying about the changes, just about going in the negative direction. And his question is, how much of the land can you walk on today compared to the surface you were able to walk on at the beginning of your walks decades ago?
Well, decades ago, I was able to walk everywhere, anywhere I wanted without being stopped and so on. Now, there are settlements almost everywhere. So, for example, let's talk around Ramallah. Around Ramallah, there is now a limited, very limited area, a few wadis, valleys that we can walk in, which even when we walk in them, we look up and we see settlements. So the possibility of walking without seeing settlements and without the possibility of getting confronting settlers has diminished. So we can walk, but not without the possibility that we can walk freely and not be harassed and not be intimidated by these settlers who are always having guns and who can call the army at any minute and claim all kinds of things against us. So the land that was possible to walk in has diminished tremendously, and you have to know exactly where to go in order to avoid settlements and avoid the wall that has been built and avoid the roads that have been built. But there are still possibilities for walking.
Okay. And I would, there was a question before that, and I will just include it. It's more specific. It asks, does Israel have any environmental law that imposes rules on how and what to build in the settlements? But yeah, perhaps also, I mean, do you feel that what we see as global environmental movements, that they have any echoes in Palestine, or what kind of echoes do they have in Palestine?
Well, you know, the problem is that the government in Israel now is a government that is dominated by the settlers. And so the rules can always be twisted in favor of the settlements. And so, for example, areas that have been designated as nature reserves have been built upon by the settlers, although they are supposedly to be kept without construction. And at the same time, the settlers throw their sewage and their garbage on the Palestinian areas and destroy many beautiful wadis. And despite many efforts at stopping them through the law, it hasn't always been possible to do that. And so the environmental laws are twisted in favor of the settlers. And Israel is not stopping the destruction. You know, what of environmental laws when all this beautiful landscape in Palestine has been destroyed by the settlements, which you can imagine if you're trying to put over 750,000 people in a small area like the West Bank in a short period of time, the destruction is going to be tremendous. And furthermore, in order to attract the settlers, they have to build the kind of roads that ensure that the settlers can move from their settlements to the center of Israel, where their work usually is, at a minimum amount of time. And so they build roads that are not fit for the West Bank. They are highways, 4 lanes, 6 lanes sometimes, and they dig through the hills and rather than follow the contours of the hills. And so all of this is destructive, and it doesn't mean that Israel is being very careful about the environmental aspects at all.
And perhaps, I mean, for me, it's always extremely important and something it's really difficult to understand, because I remember years ago, so it was 8 or even more, that the UN warned that in Gaza, there is no way that people are going to survive given the situation with the pollution of the war and the responsibility that Israel is not following and not abiding to. And yet today, people there are faced with even more horrible situation. And I think as you mentioned, in the West Bank, many Palestinians are also faced with water shortages, while it's completely different, the situation for the settlers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now we have what I was showing before were the very clear maps of how the land has somehow shrank, and we can show them again or post them later on after our conversation on Facebook. There is a question from Ada Scrignari. I don't know if I have pronounced that correctly. And she asks a question about languages. Do Palestinians learn any Hebrew, and do Jews speak Arabic? If they meet, how do they communicate?
This is a very interesting question, which I've often thought about a lot. And the point is that one indication that Israel doesn't recognize the Palestinians and doesn't want to eventually live with them is the fact that throughout the occupation, and especially in the first part, 20 years of the occupation, when Israel had full control over the curriculum and the educational system, they didn't introduce Hebrew as a language. And so they didn't care for the Palestinians to learn their language, the language of the Israelis. And in Israel, Arabic has been an official language, but more recently this has been changed. And they used to teach Arabic in school, but now they don't. And it turns out that the only people who study Arabic are the people who are interested in going into the intelligence army units. And so it's a very sad thing. I put the figures of that in a book called Occupation Diaries, where I say that it's a very sad thing that the two sides don't know. At the same time, Arabic and Hebrew are very close, the closest two languages as any two languages are. And most Palestinians who have worked in Israel speak Hebrew, or those who have been in prison speak Hebrew. So the number of Palestinians who speak Hebrew is really quite large, much more so than the Israelis who speak Arabic. And so when the two come together, which is usually now over checkpoints and imprisonment and so on, they either speak English or little bits of Hebrew and Arabic that they can manage. But the soldiers insist on speaking Hebrew to us, even though we don't understand it. And very often people have died because they didn't understand the orders that were given to them in Hebrew.
Okay. I might have mistaken it, because I've seen this beautiful short movie, The Present, that's also nominated for Oscar 2020.
I think it's won. It won.
It has won it. Okay, then I apologize. Then yes, it was probably I'm 1 year behind, which often happens. And the conversation at the checkpoint happens in English.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like this kind of a wall that helps also to preserve some kind of dignity, although it's in a totally inhumane situation.
That's right. But then, of course, the other day I had a problem with the bank and in Israel, and I tried to speak find out something about their rules in English, and they said they don't speak English. They don't know any English. and they insisted on speaking Hebrew and only Hebrew. So they used that language thing to their benefit, and they claim they don't speak English when they want to claim that they don't speak English.
Okay, sure. A question from Nada is, she's actually pointing out a paradox that people who think that the land was given to them by God go about destroying it systematically. Do you feel one can explain this?
This is a very important observation, yes, and I've often thought about this, and I've often heard it from people who come and visit and say how tragic to see these buildings built in a systematic way and in a routine way and not consistent with the contours and the beauty of the hills, and therefore destroying the beauty of the land. How is it that this is done this way? I think it's a question of greed. They want to take the most land possible as quickly as possible, in order, as they say, it's not a secret, they say it, in order to make sure that they will not be giving up the land to anybody else, that this will stay Israeli land and will not be given back. And that, of course, happened after 1967 immediately, when in Jerusalem, the policy was to build as quickly as possible settlements around Jerusalem in order to make sure that they don't give up any land. And the government and the cabinet and so on there are many quotes of statements that they said exactly that they're building settlements in order to be sure that they don't have to submit to the power, to the pressure of the Americans, as they had done in the past in 1956, to make them withdraw. Because in 1956, when they occupied, the American government made them withdraw. They didn't want this to happen again, so they speeded up the building of settlements. And as we see, every time there is any possibility of a rapprochement or possibility of a resolution, they speed up the building of settlements, exactly in order to make sure that they will not be forced to give them up. So it's greed. It's politics.
Okay. Now, somehow following perhaps this question or what your answer is a question from Boris Vaso. And if I somehow sum it up, do you feel that a settler would be able to write a book like Palestinian Walks about the same country, the same hills, the same valleys, given your relation to it and given at the same time how the settlers have actually dramatically changed the landscape, even though they claim this personal connection?
This would be a very interesting thing to think about. I haven't thought about it, but I imagine that it would be full of references to the Bible, and it would be, in my case, my relationship to the land goes back several generations, and my memory of the land goes back to many decades. And so I can speak of the land as it was in the late 70s and in the early 80s and so on, and how it is now. Whereas a settler doesn't have that historical perspective. And I think it would be more propagandist book that explains that they have the right to the land because the Bible and the religious significance of the land. And so it would be more about religion and religious significance than personal attachment, I would imagine.
Okay. Do you feel that, and this is connected also...
Sorry, but at the same time, I don't think I can say that my love to the land is unique and exclusive, because I know of many people who are not from here and who have come to visit and come to live here, who are not Palestinian, who have come to love the land. And I can't tell them you mustn't love the land because it's my land and I'm only one allowed to love it. And likewise with the Israelis, they can love the land and they obviously have a feeling towards the land, and I can't deny that.
But is it about respect as well?
respect to the land.
Yes, and to everything it includes probably and carries, the memories, the people, the plants, the animals.
I think when you try to destroy the land to the extent that they're destroying it, you don't respect the land.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the respect for the land.
Yeah, okay. Now, another question is connected to, do you feel that there are many, or is there still the voice of Israeli friends? And is this voice strong, or is it getting weaker? So do you feel that, yeah, I won't try to change the question too much, but yeah. How many people do you feel are there on the other side you talk to, or you feel are your friends and comrades?
You know, I think that one thing that is not understood and not appreciated enough is that the wall, the apartheid wall as we call it, and the barrier as the Israelis call it, or the fence as they call it, which they claim was done for security reasons, has had a very deleterious effect on the relations between the two sides. Because with the wall, it has been now several decades that, less than several decades, a decade and a half, that the Palestinians only meet with Israelis as settlers or soldiers. And the Israelis don't meet with the Palestinians either. And so the possibility of friendships and meetings are diminished. Another indication is that my books used to be bought and translated by in Israel, because there were people who wanted to know about our side. And since what was it? I think Palestinian Walks. Yeah, since Palestinian Walks, there haven't been any other books that have been translated into Hebrew. So, for example, the book where the line is drawn, which is about relations between the Palestinians and Israelis, which would have been a book that I would have liked the Israelis to read, have not been translated, and there were no offers by Israeli publishers to, because they tell me that the people do not want to read about Palestine and from the Palestinians. And so I have friends who I've had for many, many years, and we constantly keep up the relationship and meet, but it's getting more and more difficult to get together because of the restrictions and the difficulties. But we sustain that, we do it. But then I'm of a generation when these things happened and they continued, and the younger people do not have that possibility and do not have friends on the other side at all. So the relationships are minimal at best.
Does that shrink also your space of people, to somehow talk to in Palestine? Or is it mostly, I mean, how do you see somehow the world you belong to? Or in the book Going Home, in the end you write, I'm home. And I'm wondering, where is your home? Or, what is your home?
Well, the question of home has been a question that I've been very interested in for many years. In Strangers in the House, I discussed a lot about the home in Jaffa, and I discussed how I grew up thinking our real home is in Jaffa and Ramallah is just a temporary thing. And I struggled with that. And then in Rift in Time, I tried, in Palestinian Walks, I wrote about the West Bank, only the West Bank. And in Rift in Time, I wrote about the region entirely. And at one point, I stand in the Jordan Valley and look at the Great Rift and see it as one whole area, starting from the southern Turkey all the way to Mozambique, and realize that this is the natural sway of the land, and no borders are going to be fixed forever in this land. And then in Going Home, I go through in one day over the whole of Ramallah, which has been the arena of my struggles, both personal and political. And at the end, I come back home, I come back to having faced the past and having come to terms with the disappointments that have been created by the political disappointments and by the Oslo and by the failures. And I come to terms with the fact that Ramallah has changed, and sometimes to the better, sometimes to the worse. But I come back and want to do what Derek Walcott did in his very beautiful poem, which is called Love After Love. And he writes, the time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome. And I look at the mirror and am able to greet myself and say, and then I say, I'm home. So it's a coming to terms with myself that is home for me.
Okay. So it's not about, because I remember talking here with a refugee from Gaza, Mohammed Al-Burai. He mentions safety, and many people, talk about people that give the feeling of home, and home with, the key, for sure in the story of Palestine, or in the stories we know, probably in very Oriental, optics as well. Present this somehow pillar of understanding. So for you, it's a question of somehow coming to see yourself, to come to peace with you, or yeah.
Yeah, in going home, that was my intention, to finally find the peace that will allow me to feel at home, and to feel that I'm not angry or not struggling or not any longer attached to something. In other words, I've come to the point where no one can deprive me of that feeling of being at peace with myself. And so it's not contingent upon the arrival of a soldier to my house or the arrival of anything. I'm at peace with myself, and that makes me feel at home. And that could be at home anywhere else, doesn't have to be in Ramallah or Palestine.
Okay. Now we have another question that's connected with Palestinian walks and the story of Selma, and I'll try to just shorten it, or in the third chapter, and it's about her not understanding. And the question is, it seems you see in Selma a certain alienation from the land and her immediate surroundings. How do you feel this kind of alienated behavior is resolvable?
The story of Selma? Remind me.
He says, in the third chapter of Palestinian Walks, you're accompanied by Selma, with whom you stumble across a road where there used to be a Bedouin waiting for tourists. Selma excitedly points him out, and you write about that gesture. How could anyone be so irresponsible as to express pride in a dreary time like this? It seems like throughout your walks, the territory is becoming more and more abstract, losing its geological coherence. It seems you see in Selma a certain alienation from the land and her immediate surroundings. How do you feel this kind of alienated behavior is resolvable? It's a question from Jaka Bombac.
I don't remember Selma in Palestinian walks. I'm sorry.
Okay, but perhaps maybe just if we think, I mean, it seems often that we make this, ideas of there's or some kind of, how do you say, comparisons, yeah, with the experience of Palestine and with the experience of Palestinians under the occupation. And do you feel, I mean, how dangerous are these kind of comparisons in trying to universalize your experience and make it count for everybody? And it's probably something that mostly we journalists try to do, and not understanding the severity of the situation of the ground, of what you actually have to live through. Do you feel that there is this somehow feeling for the other, feeling for, the complex history, feeling for the crimes that have been committed, are committed every day? in the understanding we are able to produce in the present times?
Well, I think that the only way that people can have compassion and understand the other experiences is by thinking of their own, and the experiences of the Palestinians are universal in the sense that people feel about place and home and their rights everywhere in the world, not just in Palestine. But there are peculiarities to the experiences of Palestinians because of the history and the peculiar history, where they are people who were living in a place and they were dispossessed of that place, and that dispossession is still not recognized, and they haven't yet resolved that dispossession. And that is what is unique about Palestine. In the case of Syrians, refugees, for example, or in the case of refugees all over the world, there are tragedies that may exceed the tragedies in terms of numbers and in terms of severity, that of the Palestinians. But in all cases, they haven't lost their country. So that at the end of the war, at the end of the hostilities, they will possibly be able to go back to their country. And it's not denied that they are Syrians or that they are members of a country, whereas the Palestinians, for the longest time, couldn't even mention the word Palestine. I remember the first time I could mention Palestine in the title of a book of one of my books was in 2002, because before that, if you had Palestine in the title, the book will not be published or will not sell and will not be allowed in bookstores. So we were denied our existence, our very existence, not only our home and future and so on. And that makes the Palestinian case unique, but it shares so many other aspects with many experiences of people around the world.
Mm. And in your book, let me just, Language of War, Language of Peace, you also mentioned the Palestinian refugees and how they are not counted among all the refugees, how they are somehow separated. Now we have another question that somehow can connect also to this question, to this topic. And so what connection do you and other Palestinians in the occupied territories feel to 1948 Palestine compared to 1967 Palestine? So yeah, perhaps, I mean, the question of Palestinian refugees and coming home or coming, to the country that was yours, that is yours, and that from where you were ethnically cleansed or, forced to live in 48.
Well, there are two aspects. The first one is about the definition of refugees. Palestinian refugees are not part of the UNHCR, the International Convention on Refugees, because they have been excluded from that, which means that they have been excluded from the right to return. And they are part of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Organization, which and the point is that as long as they receive relief from UNRWA, they are not part of the convention of the 1951 convention. So Israel has succeeded, and the world has succeeded in delineating the Palestinian refugees in a special category, which makes them unable to be exercise the right of return as a right under the law. The relationship to Palestinians, between Palestinians in 48 and 67, I think that if you ask any Palestinian refugee in the occupied territories where they're from, they would always mention the land and the city and the village in Palestine of 48. So they haven't yet forgotten that, and even the youngest child who has never even seen that place would say, "I'm from Jaffa," or "I'm from these places, Ramli or Lid," or so on. And yet, the experiences of Palestinians in 48 who have stayed is so different from our experiences in 67 that it's good and bad, because it's good in the sense that the Palestinians in 48 have learned a lot about the Israeli state and a lot about how to maneuver in the politics and in the system of the Israel. And they've learned some things, very important things about Israel from being in Israel, which the Palestinians in 67 have not experienced at all. And we've only experienced occupation, which is an occupation, which is not a state. And it's not Israel, it's not an Israeli state. So the two sides share many things, share many emotions, feelings, but have different experiences, life experiences, and political experiences.
But do you feel, I mean, do you see a way forward in trying to, again, bring these experiences, like to equalize them in a way, or, you know, in the frame of respect for every human being? And I mean, can they be again harmonized and equalized in the, you know, somehow framework of respect for every human being and equality?
Well, it depends on the political developments. If there is a political resolution that allows for the Palestinians in Israel to use their experience to move things forward for all of us, then there can be good developments. But so far, we know, I mean, we both experience discrimination under Israel. The Palestinians in Israel are discriminated against in many ways, and there is a sort of apartheid against them in Israel. And the Palestinians, of course, in the West Bank also are discriminated against. The extent of the discrimination is different in both cases. So, for example, in the case of the pandemic, the Palestinians in Israel were vaccinated. The Palestinians in the West Bank were not vaccinated. The Palestinians in Israel have access to the health service, which is universal, whereas the Palestinians in the West Bank do not have that luxury. So the experiences are different, but they can be harmonized should there be a political solution that brings the two together and brings the whole situation into a new framework that allows for mutual respect and expression of rights and recognition of justice and rights.
Now, we have already somehow passed the hour that we talked about, and perhaps just my last question, not to take too much of your time, would be, you mentioned before the success of the first Intifada, and I think many of us remember or, you know, have read about the brutality of the second and everything that followed. What do you feel are somehow the lessons that should be brought to life again when it comes to the first Intifada, and could be used today to somehow guide forward the Palestinian struggle for justice and freedom?
Well, yes, there are many lessons, I think. And the most important lesson is that we are not going to succeed in any way at all by a military fight against Israel, because that's not the way to go. Ultimately, the two sides have to live together, and neither side is going to be able to destroy the other completely. And military struggle is not the way to go. The first Intifada was a non-violent Intifada, and that became very effective. And it also concentrated on building solidarity with the world. And there was a lot of people in the world who stood with us. Whereas with the second Intifada was a militarized Intifada, and terrible things happened during that struggle, which have no excuse whatsoever, in my opinion, against Israelis and civilians in Israel. And it alienated the world in many ways and brought the struggle into a much worse situation than ever before. So I think the lessons, first of all, is non-violent resistance is very important, and solidarity with the world is very important. And on these two bases, we might be able to make a change and succeed.
Okay. Because somewhere also, I think you're right that this national agenda or nationalist project has failed and it has been replaced by religion. Probably it needs to be replaced now with what? Rule of law, stories, freedom, humanity,
universality,
universality,
and the belief that